Yeah, A-Push scholars, I bet you didn't see that one coming. Mr. Beamer, that's a little teapot. That's about the Teapot Dome scandal. Warren G. Harding, maybe the president with the most scandals in American history besides, well, throwing Nixon and Grant, one of the biggest scandals. Fortunately or unfortunately for him, he died in 1923 before a lot of the scandals came to light. We've got a quote here from President Herbert Hoover, who's going to be at the end of the chapter, and he has one of the greatest quotes in American history. He's so prophetic. We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. Oh my goodness, he was wrong about that, because by 1929, the end of it, we had the Great Depression. So we're going to talk about the presidency of Harding, Coolidge, and some other key topics in A-Push. All right, first section reading is Republican Old Guard returns, much like in Oklahoma 2015. The three Republican presidents of the 1920s were pro-business, conservative, and laissez-faire. So I would highlight this. The 1920s was definitely a Republican decade. Business boomed, and we were very hands-off, our government, towards business, and they flourished in the 1920s. Warren G. Harding, his characteristics, I guess he was handsome and quite popular. Maybe not the smartest person in the world. A good guy, a likable guy, but unfortunately a lot of his people around him were very corrupt, a lot like Grant in the 1860s and 70s. All right, so Warren G. could not detect the corruption within the administration, and we already talked about Grant was the same thing. However, he did have some cool people in the cabinet. Charles Evan Hughes, who did run for president in 1960 against Wilson, was Secretary of State. Pretty popular, did a pretty good job as Secretary of State with other countries. Herbert Hoover did an excellent job with the Commerce Department. And Andrew Mellon, this name is pretty important. He was the Secretary of the Treasury, and he allowed business to flourish, allowed the wealthy to become even more wealthy, an even bigger division between the rich and poor. However, unfortunately for Harding, there were so many corrupt members, and the two is Albert Faw, the Secretary of the Interior, and Harry Doherty, corrupt, very corrupt. All right, like I mentioned, the GOP, by the way, is a symbol of the Republican Party. GOP stands for the Grand Old Party. And so the Supreme Court in the 1920s was very conservative, very laissez-faire, very pro-business. They voted against the child labor law that was in place by the progressives. So in the 1920s saw children go back into the factories. Interesting. Also, they reversed the ruling on minimum wage for women called Atkins versus Children's Hospital in 1923. So this was kind of a setback for women in the workplace. Also, antitrust laws were not very enforced or ignored in the 1920s, and so it was very pro-business, very healthy for business in the 1920s. They had a lot more say in what was going on in the economy, and I would highlight this. By 1920, the progressives are dead. Business, wealth, rule. All right, let's talk some foreign policy. After World War I, President Harding, when he was inaugurated in 1921, his famous quote is, he wants to return to normalcy. So let's get back away from the war. Let's kind of end the progressive movement. Let's get back to the way things were. And that's what happened to some degree after World War I. A lot of the government involvement with the economy was definitely gone, very hands-off. Unfortunately for labor, they did lose a lot of its power. I would highlight this. Union membership shrank by 30% in the 1920s. So even though union had a lot of gains during the progressive movement in the 20s, it went backwards. And so many of the workers, factory workers, did struggle in the 20s. However, the Veterans Bureau was created in 1921. That's still around today, trying to provide benefits, health services for our veterans, which is, of course, very important. It did provide hospitals and rehabilitation for many of the veterans coming back from World War I, and continues to this day. Also, pretty significant, Congress passed a bonus bill in 1924 to pay veterans of World War I in the year 1945. So Congress passed in 1924. 21 years later, these veterans of World War I are actually going to get paid money for their service. And this is going to become a huge issue in 1932. Perhaps remember the bonus army and the disaster of that event for Herbert Hoover. All right, more foreign policy. America never ratified the Treaty of Versailles. We know that. We never officially joined the League of Nations, although we did send unofficial observers there. So we did know what was going on, but again, we had no say or power in the League of Nations because we wanted to be very, 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 very isolationist. By 1921, we did finally pass a resolution in Congress that officially ended the war with Germany, despite the fighting stopping at the end of 1918. And disarmament, that was probably the biggest foreign policy decision of President Harding Warren G. Harding. Disarmament is the reduction of the military. We'll get to that in the next slide. All right, perhaps Harding's biggest event that you need to know in APUSH was the Washington Naval Conference, 1921 and 1922. And this naval conference was a meeting between the United States, Great Britain, and Japan to reduce the number of ships. The theory is if we have less ships, it's less likely that countries are going to go to war with each other. So this is what the Washington Naval Conference was to reduce the number of ships. And then I would highlight this. There was a battleship ratio between these three countries of 5 to 3. So we were allowed to keep, for every 5 we keep, Britain could keep 5 and Japan could only keep 3. Japan, unhappy about this, they're basically forced to sign the treaty. They felt they were treated unfairly. And again, this is all, the next 20 years are all the events leading up to World War II. This is something the Japanese did not like. But perhaps this is Harding's greatest accomplishment, perhaps because he did try to reduce the number of ships, which hopefully would prevent a future war. I don't know how important the Kellogg-Briand Pact is in 1928. It was one of Coolidge's biggest foreign policy issues, and it really didn't have a whole lot of power because basically the nations in this pact agreed to never make war with each other as offensive means. And wow, that did not work because 10 years later we are into World War II. Hey, we're halfway done. Hey, let's talk about some economics. Let's talk about the tariff. Republican in charge. What are we going to do with the tariff? Republican in charge. We are going to raise it. And that's what happens in 1922. The Republicans are in charge, so the tariff is raised, trying to protect American businesses, especially big business, from foreign competition. And so that's what happened. So the tariff was raised in the 20s. It did give the president some flexibility to raise or lower the tariff as much as 50%. So it was supposed to be more of a neutral law, but in the end, because Harding and Coolidge were pro-business, Republican, they did actually raise the tariff much more than they actually lowered it. And the economic problem with raising tariffs is that it limits trade. And Europe really needed the United States to trade with because after the war, they needed to get their economies going again. And so with this higher tariff, it made it more unlikely that the United States would buy European goods, causing the economies of Europe to struggle because they can't sell it into America. And especially the biggest country that's affected by the higher tariff is going to be Germany. We're going to talk much more about that in the rest of the chapter. All right, I'm a little teapot, short and stout. We're talking about the Teapot Dome scandal. Besides relative success in foreign policy with Harding, Warren G. Harding in the Washington Naval Conference, the other big thing he's known for is scandal. So I'd highlight this. His biggest scandal was the Teapot Dome scandal. And one of his cabinet members, Albert Faw, basically took the fall, and he did not a lot of good things. He fallen, and he couldn't get up. No idea where I'm going with this. But anyway, the cabinet member here leased public lands. This is government land out west to an oilman. Guy's name was Harry Sinclair. And actually, Harry Sinclair was in Downton Abbey in the year 2014. Pretty exciting. But anyway, Albert Faw took a bribe for $100,000. That's probably a bad thing for politicians to do that. So this made Harding's administration look bad. Another scandal, another cabinet member, the Attorney General, Harry Doherty, was accused of illegal sale of pardons and liquor permits. So another scandal. And one way, got a third one. Charles Forbes, familiar last name, head of the Veterans Bureau, cheated the government out of $200 million. That seems like quite a bit. So a lot of scandals under Harding's presidency. He's blamed for this. In 1923, Harding dies of food poisoning complications. And so most of the scandals are actually not known until shortly after his death. But Harding is considered one of the worst presidents, mostly because of these scandals, even though he didn't really have a part in any of them. All right, lastly, this goes a quick review of Warren G. Harding. Again, only president for a little over 2 years. And the biggest two things, the positive is the Washington Conference reducing the number of ships. The negatives are all of his scandals, especially the most famous one, the Teapot Dome scandal. All right, last thing I have is a political cartoon just kind of showing the corruption under the Harding administration, how the theory is the United States government in Washington is willing to sell anything to make money as a bribe. All right, Harding died in 1923. Got to replace him with the vice president. It was Silent Cal, Calvin Coolidge. And so he takes over 1923. He's president for the next 6 years. He was called Silent Cal, frankly, because he had very little personality and did not talk much. And there's a famous little joke about him that somebody said, "Hey, Cal, I bet I can get you to say more than 2 words." He responded with, "You lose." So not much personality, but he was a Republican, and he did continue the pro-business stance. All right, he was a morally clean person, thank goodness. So he was not connected to any of Harding's scandals. Like we mentioned, pro-business, and we had great prosperity in the economy in the 1920s. The hands-off approach, big business flourished in the 1920s. And Calvin Coolidge, probably known mostly for this famous quote about business. The business of America is business. So he's like, the government, get out of the way, let business flourish to create jobs and to create wealth for people. All right, the economy boomed, and everybody's no, the farmers did not succeed. Oh my goodness, factory workers struggled, farmers struggled in the 1920s. Unfortunately for the farmers, it's going to get much worse when we get to the Great Depression. But I think a must know, 1920s farmers in America struggled dramatically. Even though after the war, or during the war, the farmers prospered very well. They had new technology which increased their production, and they were feeding the world during the war. This led to a bunch of overproduction, but it was okay during the war because they could sell it overseas. However, when the war is done, this overproduction becomes a problem because with overproduction, we know this, prices will drop. And as a farmer, you want higher prices. When prices fall, you cannot really pay back your debts and you struggle. Many times you lose your land to the banks. So the farmers wanted help from the government. Of course, that is not going to happen with the laissez-faire, hands-off policy of the 1920s. However, they did get a little bit of a bone here. The farmers did get a new law saying that the farmers' cooperatives, the farmers' co-op, we got one in Hudsonville. They're actually protected from antitrust prosecution, so they did get that, have that going for them, I guess, which is nice. But again, it was a struggle overall in the 1920s, falling prices, drought, and it gets even worse in the 1930s. All right, the next section I just threw on here because there's not much to it. The three ways to the White House. Coolidge does win the election in 1924. I have no idea who he went against. I don't know who the Democrat was. Doesn't matter because the Republicans were in charge. Coolidge wins in a landslide in 1924. He's going to continue the pro-business, laissez-faire policy in a booming economy. All right, so the economy under Coolidge and Harding was pro-business, laissez-faire, hands-off, business, do what you want, make as much money. The economy boomed in the 1920s. So that's domestic policy. Foreign policy, it's all about one word, isolationism. Okay, Harding and also Coolidge did not want to get involved in the League of Nations, did not want to get involved really in the rest of the world. So we were very, very, very isolationist in the 1920s and into the 1930s. Okay, so the Senate, of course, does not want America to adhere to the World Court as part of the League of Nations. So again, we're very isolationist, did not want anything to do with it. The European debt to America was the greatest foreign policy problem in the 1920s. And that is the next section, the unraveling of the debt knot. I'm going to try to explain this to you at the bottom of this slide and also in the next slide. All right, probably one of the biggest events for Coolidge's presidency was the Dawes Plan, 1924. Okay, and this is a foreign policy plan. Basically, the rescheduled German reparations. We know that Germany had to pay France and especially France and Great Britain $33 billion after World War I. Basically, the United States would help Germany out to pay off this debt. This is the Dawes Plan. I'll show you the next slide in more detail. But American businesses and wealthy people are going to give private loans to Germany to try to help pay off their debts and help them slowly recover their economy. Last thing for this page, please realize there's a difference between the Dawes Act and the Dawes Plan. Dawes Severability Act, 1887. Any ideas? Forced assimilation of Native Americans. That's what the Dawes Act is in 1887. Cut the reservations in half. Try to make the Native Americans farmers. The Dawes Plan is all about foreign policy in the 1920s, trying to help out Germany pay off their debts. Here's the Dawes Plan, again, under Calvin Coolidge. Basically, the United States is going to give private loans to Germany to try to help them out. Germany eventually is going to have to pay us back. We gave them money to slowly try to rebuild their economy, but mostly so Germany could pay back France and Great Britain the $33 billion that they owed in reparations. So we gave money to Germany so Germany could pay France and Great Britain the reparations. France and Great Britain would take their money, try to slowly rebuild their economy, and also pay back the United States from their World War I debts. So this is basically what it is. We loaned money out to pay ourselves. That's kind of a weird way to think about it. We gave money to Germany to help them out so they could pay back their debts to France and Great Britain. They would take this money and try to pay back the United States. And that worked for a while until 1933, Adolf Hitler takes over and says, no, we aren't doing this anymore, and we are on our way to World War II. All right, finally, a quick review of Calvin Coolidge. Biggest thing for him is the Dawes Plan in terms of foreign policy, giving Germany money to give the Allies back to the United States. And then His other two policies that I think are very important, foreign policy, were very isolationist, did not want to get involved in the League of Nations, so we were hands off. Interesting cartoon, kind of a chuckler. Maybe more of a chuckler is his domestic policy about laissez-faire. We're going to let businesses do what they want because you can't make laissez-faire mandatory. Nah, good night.